In this video, you will get a first overview of utilitarianism, a very important and still highly topical moral philosophical position. The term utilitarianism comes from the Latin word utilitas, which means utility. It is therefore an ethics of utility that judges actions according to whether they have the greatest possible benefit. However, it is not just about one's own benefit, but about the benefit for the greatest possible number of people affected. Three important representatives of utilitarianism are Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, and Peter Singer. Although Bentham was the first to introduce utilitarianism in Europe, the doctrines of utility existed long before him. The Chinese scholar Mo Tse, who lived around 470 to 391 BC, demanded that every theory and every practical measure should be measured by the yardstick of whether it inhibits or promotes the prosperity and growth of the population. And 100 years later, the ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus, who lived from 341 to 270 BC, formulated some of the questions and solutions that were later adopted by the utilitarians. Jeremy Bentham was the first to systematically develop the moral concept of utilitarianism around the time of the French Revolution. John Stuart Mill was educated in utilitarianism by his father James Mill, a close friend of Bentham. However, he differed from Bentham on a number of key points and expanded and modified his concept. Bentham and Mill are representatives of classical utilitarianism. The Australian philosopher Peter Singer, on the other hand, developed a modern form of utilitarianism, preference utilitarianism. In utilitarianism, humans are considered as creatures of need that are geared towards maximizing pleasure or joy and minimizing displeasure, that is, pain and suffering. All people are governed by a single motive. They want to experience pleasure and avoid suffering. Classical utilitarianism measures the benefit of actions by this standard, namely the maximization of pleasure and minimization of displeasure. Utilitarianism can be described with 4 adjectives. It is egalitarian. This means that the needs of all persons involved in an action must be considered equally. It is hedonistic. As already mentioned in the image of man, it sees the satisfaction of pleasure as man's most important goal. It is consequentialist. This means that the consequences of an action are assessed, and it is teleological. The goal or purpose of an action plays a very important role. As already mentioned, this goal is the maximization of joy and the minimization of suffering. The core principle of utilitarianism can be summarized with the so-called utilitarian imperative. Act in such a way that the consequences of your action or rule of action are optimal for the well-being of all those affected. This imperative contains the 4 principles of utilitarianism: the principle of consequences, the hedonistic principle, the universalist principle, and the principle of utility. But what exactly do these 4 principles mean? The principle of consequences states that actions are judged according to their consequences. In other words, only the consequences of an action are considered. The action itself and the motive behind the action are completely irrelevant. Here, we can already see a very clear difference to Kant, who completely excludes the consequences for the moral assessment of an action and only looks at the motive behind the action. The hedonistic principle means that the consequences of actions are judged according to the maximization of pleasure or minimization of displeasure. Whether an action is moral therefore depends on whether it increases joy or reduces pain. The various utilitarian philosophers sometimes understand pleasure in very different ways. While Bentham considers all possible pleasures equally, Mill values mental pleasures more than physical ones, and Singer no longer speaks only of pleasure, but also of preferences. Strictly speaking, the hedonistic principle, therefore, only applies in classical utilitarianism, which defines happiness as pleasure and the absence of suffering. In preferential utilitarianism, where it is about the preferences or interests of all those affected by an action, this principle is not always appropriate. The universalist principle means that the well-being of all those affected by the action is at stake. All persons are considered equally. No one counts more than another for any reason. Since utilitarianism judges actions according to whether they promote pleasure or reduce displeasure, animals are often also moral objects here, so animals are also taken into account when calculating the pleasure-displeasure balance. The fourth principle is the principle of utility. According to this, actions are evaluated on the basis of their benefit for the individual and those affected by the action. It is an ethical cost-benefit calculation. The cost is the suffering, the benefit is the pleasure. You have to calculate whether the planned action will result in more pleasure or more suffering for those affected. If there is more pleasure, the action is moral. If there is more suffering, it is immoral. Now, you know the most important representatives and principles of utilitarianism, and have learned that this ethic represents a counterposition to Kant's ethics of duty. We will find out what the individual positions within utilitarianism are all about and how they differ from one another in the next episodes of this series.